Under the warm California sky, a quiet storm gathered behind the polished glass walls of Forrester Creations. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, the kind of day when joy ripples through the corridors like sunlight dancing on silk. But beneath the surface, every smile hid a secret, and every heart carried its own fracture. Deke Sharp stood alone, his reflection merging with that of a world that had once embraced him and now turned uncertain. He had come to make amends, to rebuild what his own silence had shattered, but the truth he carried was heavier than remorse. It was the realization that forgiveness was not a destination, but a battlefield. Electra Forrester had once believed in the good in people, in second chances and soft endings, until betrayal rewrote her definition of love. The memory of Remy Price lingered like smoke in her lungs, inescapable, choking, uninvited. When Deke approached, she felt a tremor of something familiar, something that once promised comfort and instead delivered pain. Deke's guilt ran deeper than anyone knew. He saw in Electra's eyes the scars left by the man he had chosen to trust, and that knowledge began to consume him. Meanwhile, at the Spencer home, laughter disguised anxiety. Beth Spencer's tiny hands flipped through pages of bridal magazines as though she were building a fortress of dreams, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond her family's fragile peace. The little girl's heart overflowed with excitement at the thought of her parents, Hope Logan and Liam Spencer, finally reuniting under vows that once broke them apart. She imagined flowers, music, and the soft rhythm of joy that should accompany every "I do." But beneath her innocent plans lay an unspoken rule of the Spencer bloodline. Happiness, in this family, never came without sacrifice. When Beth mentioned her grandfather Deke, her voice carried the tender hope of a child who still believed love could conquer its own history. Yet when she spoke of Sheila Carter, her tone shifted to fear. Beth had heard enough whispers, seen enough shadows in her parents' eyes to understand that danger sometimes came wearing a smile. Hope sat silently as Beth spoke, every word carving itself into her conscience. To her daughter, this was just a wedding. To Hope, it was a balancing act between redemption and ruin. She loved Liam, or perhaps she loved what they once were, but she also knew that every step toward the altar resurrected ghosts she could not bury. Sheila's name echoed like a warning, and the mere thought of telling Deke that his lover was not welcome stirred a familiar ache in Hope's heart. Family had always been her strength and her weakness. Deacon, her father, was a man of contradictions, charming yet haunted, loving yet destructive. The idea of breaking his heart again, even for the sake of her daughter's safety, felt like fate repeating its cruelest refrain. And yet, there was no choice. Love demanded blood, and this time, it might be hers. At Forrester Creations, the air thickened with tension as Deke introduced Remy Price to his colleagues. The chatter stopped, the laughter died, and in that heavy silence, Deke read the truth written on their faces before anyone spoke. Remy's name carried history, not just with Electra, but with others who still carried invisible bruises from his past. Deke's breath caught as he saw the flicker of fear, disgust, and disbelief in their eyes. It was then that he realized forgiveness was a currency too expensive for the world he was part of. When Remy tried to explain himself, to speak of change, of redemption, of a man reborn, Deke could hear only the echo of Electra's pain. He had once told himself that love could heal what time had broken, but now he understood that love, when misdirected, could be the sharpest knife of all. The guilt that consumed him wasn't just for Electra, it was for the part of himself that had enabled her suffering. Electra had spent years mastering the art of composure. Her smile, once genuine, had become armor. But seeing Deke again, remorse etched into every movement, stirred something she had buried, not affection, but recognition. She saw in him the reflection of her own survival. When he reached out, there was no accusation in her eyes, only the quiet exhaustion of someone who had carried too many apologies for too long. Deke wanted to make it right, but Electra knew that right was an illusion. People don't fix pain, they just learn to live around it. Still, there was something about his sincerity that made her question whether the walls she built had become her prison. And in that moment, she faced a choice she wasn't ready for: to forgive or to remember. Across town, Hope tried to breathe under the weight of her own decisions. Liam had no idea how much she doubted the path they were on, and yet she continued, step by step, into the ceremony Beth had so lovingly imagined. Every thread of her dress, every flower on the table, felt like a distraction from the truth she could not face. Sheila was not just an unwanted guest. She was a living reminder of how darkness always found a way back into their lives. Deacon's love for Sheila had always been a paradox, self-destructive, obsessive, yet deeply human. And now, the burden fell on Hope to sever that connection, to protect her child, and perhaps to save her father from himself. But what if in doing so, she destroyed the last bridge between them? What if love and loyalty were destined to be each other's undoing? As the sun began to dip behind the Forrester building, Deke stood by the window, his reflection merging with the dying light. He thought about the years he had wasted trying to outrun his own shadow, about the people who had paid the price for his choices. He thought about Beth, his granddaughter, whose faith in family gave him hope, and about the wedding she so eagerly planned, a symbol of unity that might crumble before it even began. And most of all, he thought about Remy, the man who claimed to have changed but whose very presence threatened to unravel everything Deke had tried to rebuild. When Deke closed his eyes, he saw Electra's face, the pain she tried to hide, and he knew that redemption, for him, would come not from being forgiven but from protecting those who still believed he could be better. Electra, alone in her studio, felt the world pressing against her chest. The memories she had tried to silence came roaring back. The manipulation, the betrayal, the nights she questioned her worth. She had thought that time would dull the sharpness of what Remy had done, but it hadn't. It had only made the silence heavier. Deke's apology had opened a door she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through, because forgiveness, once spoken, becomes a promise. Could she make that promise? Could she trust that the same man who once ignored her pain now truly understood it? Or would she once again find herself shattered by the very compassion that made her human? And so, as evening fell over Los Angeles, the worlds of the Forresters, Spencers, and Sharps converged in a quiet, invisible storm. Beth's innocent joy collided with her parents' buried fears. Hope's love for Liam tangled with her duty as a daughter. Deke's remorse intertwined with Electra's guarded heart. Every thread of this story was pulled tighter, and the tension hummed beneath the city lights. There would be weddings and promises, apologies and betrayals, but no amount of planning could control the chaos already set in motion. In the end, it wasn't the vows that would define them, but the secrets they carried to the altar. And as the night deepened, a single question lingered like a ghostly whisper over all their lives. When love is built on the ruins of regret, how long before the ground gives way again? Under the dim Californian light that painted the sky in molten shades of gold and ash, the returning echo of Thomas Forrester's footsteps across Los Angeles carried the weight of unfinished stories and buried truths. He had left the city to find clarity, to detach himself from the chaos that always followed his family, but LA had a way of pulling its children back into the web of secrets it spun around them. As he looked across the skyline, his heart carried an ache that wasn't just nostalgia. It was the haunting awareness that no matter how far he went, the Forrester name would always bind him to a cycle of love, betrayal, and consequence. He had come home to see his mother, Taylor Hayes, believing he would find her steadier than before, the same warm soul who had spent years carrying everyone else's pain while quietly ignoring her own. But fate was preparing to strip away the comfort of that illusion. What awaited him was not healing or family, but a truth that would once again fracture the fragile harmony of the Forresters, a truth shaped by a name that had already caused enough destruction to last a lifetime: Deacon Sharp. Taylor had always believed in mending what was broken, but somewhere along that pursuit, she had forgotten how to protect herself from the very hearts she tried to fix. Her love for Ridge Forrester had been both her salvation and her curse. Decades of shared history, Stolen moments and shattered promises had carved deep lines of longing into her existence. She had finally thought she would have him forever when he accepted her proposal, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if destiny had finally repaid her patience. But destiny, in this family, was cruel. Brooke Logan's name still lingered in every corner of Ridge's conscience. The moment he saved Brooke's life, everything Taylor had built with him crumbled. He returned to Brooke not because she deserved him more, but because the past never truly let him go. And when the wedding that Taylor had imagined so vividly evaporated into air, all that was left was humiliation, exhaustion, and a wound that bled in silence. Thomas, who had once imagined his parents' reunion as a symbol of family restored, could barely contain his fury when he returned to LA and learned that his father had chosen Brooke once more. He had dreamt of watching his parents exchange vows, of seeing his mother smile without sorrow, but instead, he walked into a celebration that wasn't hers. His anger was righteous and raw, a son's instinct to protect the parent who had always protected him. Yet, in a bitter twist of fate, the same man who could never forgive Brooke for her repeated betrayals found himself extending forgiveness when Ridge explained his heart. Standing in that polished Forrester Creations office, surrounded by photographs of elegance and empire, Thomas surprised himself when he embraced Brooke. Perhaps it wasn't acceptance, it was surrender. Surrender to a pattern that no longer needed words, because everyone already knew how it would end. Ridge and Brooke were gravity. Everyone else merely orbited their chaos. Far away from the glare of family expectation, Taylor's life had taken a turn she had not foreseen. She had returned to her work, seeking refuge in psychology, trying to fix strangers so she wouldn't have to confront her own shattered reflection. When Deacon Sharp walked into her office again, broken by rage and confusion after discovering Sheila Carter's lies about Luna Nozawa's survival, Taylor recognized the pain that mirrored her own. Deacon was a man torn between guilt and desire, between the urge to do good and the addiction to disaster. His love for Sheila had nearly destroyed him, but what lingered beneath that ruin was a human being still desperate to believe he could change. Taylor saw that flicker and mistook it for hope. She had always been drawn to lost souls, men who needed her more than they loved her. But this time, the gravity between them was dangerous. The connection reignited old sparks from their earlier conversations, fragments of empathy, longing, and something neither dared to name. Deacon found himself confiding in her again, his voice cracking under the weight of remorse, his mind seeking forgiveness in a place it did not belong. The boundary between patient and doctor blurred, then vanished entirely, as their eyes lingered too long, as shared pain began to feel like shared need. Taylor tried to pull away, to remind herself of ethics, of rules, of the fragile line between compassion and self-destruction. But the heart has its own logic, one that doesn't ask permission. The more she resisted, the more she found herself drawn to Deacon's vulnerability. He made her feel seen, not as a mother, not as a doctor, but as a woman who had spent too long being strong. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. Meanwhile, Sheila had been watching. She had seen the shift in Deacon's behavior, the distance, the guilt, the sudden absences. For a woman who thrived on control, that was unacceptable. Her love for Deacon was possessive, a love built on fear of abandonment rather than trust. When she caught a glimpse of Taylor and Deacon together, his hand brushing against Taylor's arm, her eyes softening with something dangerously close to affection, Sheila's rage ignited like wildfire. She would not lose him. Not again. Not to someone like Taylor Hayes, the paragon of morality who once condemned her for the very crimes she herself had forgiven in others. For Sheila, this wasn't about love anymore, it was war, and Taylor had just become her next obsession. And then there was Thomas. His return to Los Angeles wasn't just about family, it was about reckoning. He wanted to understand why his life kept circling the same pain, why every attempt at stability collapsed under the weight of love gone wrong. He began visiting his mother's office again, dropping by unannounced as he always had. It was his way of grounding himself, of finding reassurance in the one person who had never stopped believing in his redemption. But this time, the air in Taylor's office felt different. The soft scent of Deacon's cologne lingered faintly, the kind of trace that spoke of time spent too close. The way Taylor fidgeted when he mentioned Deacon's name was not lost on him. Something in his gut whispered that there was a truth she was hiding, one that would change everything. Then came the day when he saw it. Taylor, in Deacon's arms, her face buried against his shoulder, her defenses down, her heart exposed. It wasn't a professional embrace. It wasn't therapy. It was longing, raw and undeniable. For a second, Thomas couldn't breathe. The room around him tilted. He felt anger rise like a tidal wave, but beneath that was heartbreak, because he realized his mother had become the very thing she had warned him against. Love had made her vulnerable again. He wanted to storm in, to shout, to demand an explanation, but something in her fragile posture stopped him. She wasn't sinning. She was surviving. Still, the sight burned into his mind, and with it came a fear he couldn't shake. What if the world saw her this way? What if Ridge found out? What if the Forrester name, already strained by scandal, was dragged through yet another storm? That night, Thomas stood outside the Forrester mansion, the familiar grandeur of the home that had witnessed decades of triumph and betrayal. Inside, laughter spilled faintly from a dinner gathering, but he could only hear the echoes of the truth he now carried. Should he protect his mother from the judgment that would come, or expose the truth before someone like Sheila used it first? The dilemma tore him apart. He loved Taylor too deeply to see her destroyed, but he had learned from his own mistakes that silence only breeds more chaos. Every choice felt like a trap, and every outcome promised pain. Meanwhile, Taylor lay awake, guilt tightening around her like a vice. She knew what she was risking: her career, her reputation, her relationship with her son. And yet, she couldn't deny the warmth that Deacon had brought back into her life. After years of loneliness and moral restraint, she finally felt alive again. But the cost of that feeling was steep. When she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas's face, disappointed, confused, betrayed. She knew it was only a matter of time before the truth reached him, and when it did, her carefully rebuilt world would collapse. Still, she couldn't stop. Maybe it wasn't love. Maybe it was two broken people clinging to each other's pieces, trying to feel whole. But in a world like theirs, even that was too much to ask for. In another corner of the city, Deacon struggled with his own conscience. He had tried to tell himself that what he felt for Taylor was gratitude, respect, a harmless attraction. But that was a lie. He was falling for her, deeply and recklessly. It scared him because every time he cared about someone, disaster followed. Sheila had once been proof of that. And now, as he replayed the moments he had spent with Taylor, the way she listened without judgment, the way her eyes softened when he broke down, he knew this was different. He wanted to be worthy of her, but he also knew that wanting her meant betraying every line of decency he had fought to reclaim. The tension built like a gathering storm. Taylor and Deacon's connection deepened in secret, while Thomas's suspicions hardened into certainty. Brooke, ever watchful, began noticing the subtle shifts in Deacon's demeanor, the distracted gaze, the restless silences. It wouldn't take long before whispers reached Ridge, and once they did, the past would repeat itself in ways none of them were ready for. Forrester Creations, a place built on perfection, would once again become the stage for scandal. And somewhere in the shadows, Sheila waited. She had not forgotten. She had seen. And when the time came, she would make sure the world saw too. As autumn descended over Los Angeles, the Forrester world teetered on the brink of another implosion. Thomas carried the secret like a curse, Deacon wrestled with guilt, and Taylor found herself trapped between love and morality. Each step they took drew them closer to exposure, each heartbeat sinking with a quiet countdown to revelation. There was no undoing what had been set in motion, no escaping the inevitable collision between truth and desire. And when that collision came, it would not simply destroy reputations, It would question the very essence of forgiveness in a family that had built its legacy on it. Because in the end, the question that lingered like a shadow over every Forrester heart was this: when love defies reason and redemption defies rules, is it sin or survival?